So I came across an interesting way of editing fiction. Usually I would write on a computer or hammer it out on a typewriter, and then I would labor over with a ballpoint pen here and there and add paragraphs and paragraphs and cut sentences and change this word and alter this sentence and move this sentence around and move this up. And laptops made this really easy, but I still would go through the process of hammering it out on a laptop. And then I would go through the cost of printing it out, and then I would edit it by hand. And that seemed like the preferable way of doing it. You have the tactile, feeling hands on paper, ballpoint pen way of belaboring a sentence or a word or a paragraph. And before you know it, I would have the backside of the printed page written down with paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of this little tidbit here and that little tidbit there. And I usually would go through this process only because if I just did editing on the laptop, before you know it, I'd have a 20-page short story turn into a 400-page novel. Kind of tough to finish things at that route because I don't have much. Well, I've never suffered from any kind of writer's block. I'm just quite the opposite. But I also lack some level of discipline. So doing editing strictly on a laptop was like a kid in a candy store. And it would just become a big, huge mess. So I tried to keep it down to pen and paper. You would hammer out the first draft, bang, and then you would print it all out. And then you would go through and edit by hand. And it worked. And then I came across this idea of, podcasts are popular. Why don't I do a podcast? I could read out my short stories. And I thought to myself, that would be kind of an interesting way of editing, just to read the story out and to see how it would sound. And it's a good way of editing where I seem to find errors, and I don't follow strict grammar, kind of break and bend rules. And the other thing too, which would make reading a short story or a novel a little more of a challenge, is that I try to reduce the amount of he said, she said, blah, 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 he said this, blah, blah, blah. He said, she stated, he stated. That little part. So you got quotation marks with the statement. Obviously, that character is saying something, and the he said is only a placeholder for the character that made the statement. And as long as the visual of seeing the pacing of the language and the quotation marks, you would mitigate the number of he says, she says, he said, she says down to a minimum. And it was just one of those things that have always bothered me was the he said, she said by the seashore kind of, it's saying someone said something while using quotation marks seemed kind of a redundancy. I imagine it's a visual necessity to identify that character was the one who said that. Because if you have this like avant-garde story with nothing but quotation marks, it's tough to identify, who's saying what. Not that I want to be avant-garde. Seems kind of absurd and self-congratulatory and self-indulgent. But adding descriptions of actions while the person is saying something helps to replace he said, she said. But anyway, the idea was to record some cockamamie pipe dream podcast with the idea of editing while I wrote. So this is kind of a writer's notebook as well as reading the story. So, that being said, I will start this off with reading the first chapter of a novel, Bullet Out of Night. Bullet Out of Night, Chapter 1. The green dump truck lurched into the street, a mass of lethargic steel struggling to reach a speed limit that didn't antagonize the surrounding traffic. City stoplights, stop signs, and busy intersections followed from the center of town, becoming contests for vehicles to speed around the big truck rather than get stuck behind it. Every human being was more important than the next, each in a contest, set against each other as if in a blood feud. I'll get mine before you get yours. I'll cut your throat for it, cut your mother's throat for it. For 3 seconds or 3 pennies, for the 3 nickels I'd sell your soul for, I'll draw blood at the first sign of weakness. For the win. Always for the win, with my hands around your throat. As always, heavy trucks entering a highway were outraged upon by cars threatening each other to be first to pass, buzzing by with all the fury of bees in a hive. Rusty minivans and fashionable sport utility vehicles rushed to fill the lane in front of the slower-moving truck, daring each other to push the other into the ditch. In this transit combat, the occasional highway hero was pulled over for speeding, quite often in a vehicle regularly responsible for high-speed games, with big wings and big wheels and big noise. The dump truck came into the urbanized countryside, taking less effort to maintain speed along rows of isolated farmhouses and rusty wire fences. The city in its outrage was a not-so-distant memory, where only the tallest signs and buildings were seen from a distance. Traffic thinned as the county roads narrowed into country isolation. The truck's mass played against the other side of the road, the slow-moving midnight of hard shadows passing over the ditch flowers and bugs under a thin wake of dust. Fence posts and barbed wire flicked by in rhythm with the washboard noise of hard rubber tires. From behind, the city was a ruddy haze under a nearing sunset. From there, gravity and the machine's weight conspired against the engine's effort, the blackened exhaust stacks choking out soot with every gear change. The cab shuddered against the frame. The doors rattled on loose hinge pins. The fiberglass cowl covering the engine flapped around the fenders and bumper, thin fissures forming frizzy fractures where the fiberglass crumbled against sturdier steel parts. One headlight shivered on broken screws, a partial repair requiring some length of coat-hanger wire and resin. Duct tape was never far behind the genius of afterthought repairs. Corrosion and grime caked the frame and the axles, where grease and oil leaked. Rust encased moving parts that didn't sit still long enough for dirt to stick, the springs, wires, and frayed cables looking as torn tendons and nerves. Time and age offered the machine to the earth as sacrifice in the act of mixing rust with mud and oil, to eventually decay and return to the soil from which it came by sweat and toil. The machine's glory was once more reclaimed in moments between its birth in a factory and death in a junkyard. No fanfare or parade, no long history is written. The dump truck will leave no dinosaur bones behind in millennia to follow to prove to the future this machine existed, only a red and black oxide staining the earth. The driver's right hand clutched the gear knob, a cracked plastic ball screwed into a shaft through a hole in the floor. The knob was polished to a scratched shine like a billiard ball. Dust wavered up through the hole where the transmission could be seen. Under the road noise was a telltale whine of old gears. A stubby hand-rolled cigarette was pinched between his fingers, with a smooth gold band snug against the bottom of his third finger. It was his brother's wedding ring. "Keep it for me, Dan. Keep it safe for when I get out." So this is the first half of Chapter 1. chapter 2 to follow soon with more illustration work and artwork related to the story specifically. Thank you for watching.